And so my father looked at me. I recall a wry smile on his face saying, I think, Manish, that's a very good deal for you to acquire and manage. So that's what I did. And it took me 2 years to realize we will produce lots of cash flow from it, but it's going to drive me nuts. Let's say I cut my teeth on that type of deal.
So that was your kind of your property education.
That was my education in a live scenario. Almost anything we bought went up in value, and my ego made the mistake of thinking it was my doing. And thank God for the 2007-2009 crash, which taught me very, very quickly that the market can take you up and bring you down very, very quickly, and there's very little that's really in your control. I look back and I think, do you know what? There are very few people who'll be brutally honest with you. And my father did the privilege of being brutally honest with me.
Manish, welcome to the People Property Place podcast.
Thank you very much for inviting me, man.
It is genuinely, it's a real honour and a real privilege, because I know you've never done one of these before.
No.
And you very, very rarely talk to press or talk publicly about your background and experience. So honestly, it's a real privilege that you're here today to talk to me. So I'm really keen to unpack a little bit about your journey and Aprirose. But before we get on to a little bit more around the present day, can you rewind the clock and tell me, did you choose real estate, or did real estate choose you?
I'd say real estate chose me. My father set up this business in 1987 when I still hadn't even sat my A-levels. So you fast forward to a point in time in 1996. And in essence, my father said, it's time you left what you're doing and joined me in doing what I'm doing. And I think we used to call it property in those days. He said, I'm in property, you're joining me, and you're going to enjoy it. I said, fine, Dad, if that's what you say, that's what I'm going to do.
And your father, you said he was an accountant. And then how did he, what career did he pursue before he started the kind of the side hustle, which is Aprirose in the real estate investing? How did he kind of generate the profits to then start investing in real estate?
Actually, he trained as a chartered accountant in London in 1958, which is quite an unusual thing for somebody of Indian origin to be able to do here in London, if you cast your mind back. And by the way, Kenya until 1963 was still an apartheid state. And again, independence in 1963. So in 1958, my father left an apartheid state and came to London to study as an Indian, which was quite a weird thing to do. So he qualified as a chartered accountant, and then he went back to Kenya to work as a chartered accountant with a company called Bell House Mwangi, which, if you fast forward today, is now owned by Ernst & Young, funnily enough. And then his father passed away quite early on when my dad was still working as an accountant, and he decided to join the family business. And the family business at that time was a mixture of things, trading tires and petroleum. And then as time progressed, he set up a soap factory. So my father was actually a manufacturer and distributor of soap in Kenya and the wider East Africa.
Wow.
So that's how he made some money, and the surpluses would be invested in UK commercial real estate.
And then it got to a stage where you emigrated to the UK,
Yeah.
and then he started moving into property kind of full time.
Yes.
And then friends and family said, I want a
Correct.
little slice of that.
Yeah, exactly right.
And then before he knew it, he had a property business on his hands, did he? And what was, in terms of the first few deals, was it focused on shops and uppers in central London? Was it industrial logistics? What kind of assets?
It was very much shops and uppers when he started. It's easy to understand intuitively, and he isn't a chartered surveyor. He didn't grow up in the UK, so shops and uppers is something that's quite easily accessible and understood. And so that's the sort of things he was doing. And I wouldn't even say central London; it was sort of more outer London, and supermarkets and certain offices and certain starter industrial units. Again, mostly in suburban London. things, areas he was familiar with, and streets that he would know, and he would understand the supply-demand characteristics. So, let's just say property 101 in the late 80s. And then came the UK had quite a abysmal time in 1989 when the pound was kicked out of the exchange rate mechanism, and UK interest rates, I think, peaked at 14% between 89 and 92. And if you can imagine what's happened over the last 3 years here in the UK, they went from 0 to 5%. Imagine, I think they were at 4 or 5% going up to 14%. You can imagine the shock that came into the real estate market. So at that point in time, my father saw that there's potentially quite a bit of dislocation in the real estate world. As a polite term, it was carnage. And he got on a plane to Kenya, saw his friends and family, and said, "Guys, I don't think there's going to be a better buying opportunity." Got quite a bit of support, and got busy. 91, 92 onwards. And so that's when I'd say his, Aprirose started to build a real sort of assets under management.
And so for you were brought in to work with him. Was that to kind of bolster the deal origination side? Was it to kind of go and capital raise and expand the investor base? Or was it a bit of doing everything?
If you think about 4 people in the office, everybody does everything, right? So the truth is, 92 onwards, my father saw lots of opportunity and had lots of support from his investors. And 92 to 96, he just kept on buying assets, and it was pretty full on. We are responsible for collecting rents, accounting for it, accounting to the taxman for it, insuring it, managing it, dealing with the tenants, and so forth. At the same time, acquisitions and sales are going on. So it was literally just adding bandwidth to the business, if you will.
Talk to me about that kind of journey, and you touched on just the broad church of deals that you invested in. What kind of ticket sizes were they, and talk to me about how you scaled the business?
Yeah, so I think, let's say when I joined in 96, the largest deal that he had done was probably 10 million, something like that. And it was, I think it was, there was an auction catalog. There's a construction business called Molem that used to own HSS Hire, which still exists. And they wanted to recapitalize their company by selling some of the assets, so that they were doing a sale and lease back. And my father underwrote an entire auction catalog and ended up owning 22 assets in one shot. And then I think he had some commitment, but he again got on a plane and got the rest of it acquired. And I think he got his debt approved in about a day and a half with his local bank manager, and then was able to close the transaction in 20 days. It was quite interesting times. And when I joined, I got excited about a very high yielding regional office and retail unit in Trafford Park in Manchester, and the deal was around £300,000 and had 14 tenants in it. And so I got really excited because I think it was a 12-13% yield. Interest rates were at 5%, and you do a quick, borrow 50%, do quick mathematics, and wow, you're throwing off tons of cash flow. What I didn't realize is what it takes to manage an asset like that. And so my father looked at me. I think now I recall a wry smile on his face, saying, "I think, Manish, that's a very good deal for you to acquire and manage." So that's what I did. And it took me 2 years to realize we will produce lots of cash flow from it, but it's going to drive me nuts, dealing with those 14 tenants. You can imagine it's 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 pounds a year rent. And you got to go and talk to those guys, collect the rents and the service charge, account for it, and so forth. So let's say I cut my teeth on that type of deal.
So that was your kind of your property education,
That
effectively.
was my education in a live scenario. Over 2 years, I learned what the law, landlord and tenant law, says in principle, what it actually is in practice, how you deal with tenants, what due diligence looks like on the way in, on the way out, how you account to a bank. My father did bring in a 50% partner, how you account to investors. And you know, I think more than anything else, through and through, because it's so full on, you have no choice but to be yourself. And so I guess whether you're dealing with the bank or the tenants or the investors or whoever, you know, as long as you're dealing with integrity, I think not much can go wrong. And I think that's probably the biggest lesson I learned from all of that, apart from the sort of nuts and bolts of finance, law, and HMRC, and so on and so forth. So.
Talk to me about the early 2000s and scaling the platform and how you built up the portfolio.
So often my father and I would get on a plane and go off to East Africa to meet those same friends, family, investors, and they would see two people, father and son team, and actually a lot of businesses in lots of parts of the world are sort of family run, first, second, third generation businesses. So, you know, it sort of resonated with the investors that here's a father and son team running a real estate business, and we are a manufacturer or a banking business in East Africa. And this is quite interesting. And of course, my father's contemporaries had their children joining their businesses. So as we go there, people just got a little bit more comfort to say there's longevity, there's what's the word?
Succession planning.
Yeah, there's some succession planning here, and there's two instead of one. If somebody were to be run over by a bus, there's somebody else looking after it, and so forth. So, and actually, it was very positive. I think, you know, investors got a bit more faith in that there were two people rather than one, and bandwidth was greater, and so forth. So and let's not forget, 96 to 2006 was a golden time to invest in real estate. Yields were high, interest rates were coming down, the market wasn't great if you're an owner, meaning prices were low, hence yields were high. And it was, again, a time when 25-year leases prevailed, the UK commercial real estate market, landlord-tenant law, et cetera, was quite favorable to the landlord. So was the tax system. SDLT, stamp duty, as it was called then, was 1%.
Wow.
Offshore investors, which most of us are, didn't pay any capital gains tax on commercial real estate. So it was a fantastic time to be investing. And so as we got on the plane, and as I got on the plane more often, started scaling the size of the deals we look at, scaling the number and size of the investors that we dealt with, the business mushroomed quite a bit and got more and more interesting.
And was the kind of the thesis, we're going to be developer traders and we're going to be opportunistic and we're going to be in and out of deals when they hit particular thresholds, or was it more about an income play and a surety and kind of core index linked predictable cash flows from real estate, or was it a blend and you're trying to build a portfolio to appease different investors and then what their appetite was?
No, again, this is very much, you know, it's what we like. So, you know, we create the investment thesis, if you will, right? And then the investors sort of
back you.
Back
So it was
us,
really
pretty
what
much.
your risk appetite was and
Absolutely,
how you felt.
But as investors ourselves, the risk appetite is fairly low, right? It's classic, investment 101, right? You want the highest return for the lowest risk. So, I guess the basic philosophy is you can't really go wrong with income. And income you can understand, income can fluctuate, but capital values it's very difficult to predict capital values. You can make extraordinary amounts of money, you can lose extraordinary amounts of money, but income is a lot more predictable. So you translate that, what it means is that we were pretty much core plus orientated, up and built assets and predictable income streams. That's, if you will, the DNA of the business. Now, you overlay that with all kinds of assets. Hotels are easy to understand in terms of the forecasted income streams, pandemic notwithstanding, but and offices to an extent, albeit it's bumpier than a hotel. Retail similar, but if it's a parade of retail shops, then again, income is reasonably predictable. Same goes with industrial estates and so forth. And then having been, I moved to this country when I was 14, went straight to boarding school, grew up, so did my A-levels, went to university here, took the train to the city every day to train with Ernst & Young and so forth. I would say I was kind of bred here. Culturally, you understand real estate. You also understand geographies. And so, what it translates into is that we could invest across the country, across asset classes, as long as they are, let's say, risk-averse, income-orientated under the hood or in the DNA of the deals.
How did you materially scale the business? Because I guess there's two ways. There's one is to increase your investor base, who are all writing, and I'm assuming here, relatively small checks. And so you go much broader and you have hundreds of thousands of investors all writing smaller checks. Or you start looking for bigger fish who are going to write much larger checks, and you kind of move away from that kind of friends and family group that initially backed you to have fewer investors, but who've got deeper pockets. That enables you to have less admin, less investor relations and management, but also enables you to play in a tier or two or three above what you were doing initially.
Yeah. I guess, I think professionalize is the wrong word, but as you become more systematic in the way that you approach things, the way that you report to investors, as you grow in scale, you build up infrastructure to be able to handle bigger deals, more banking relationships, and so forth. The kind of investor that you are able to work with also grows. So exactly as you say, you get bigger fish interested in what you do. But at the end of it, we deliver quite a bespoke service. It isn't a fund, it's deal by deal, and each investor evaluates the deal on its own merits. So the investor has the choice of how much to take in which deal at what time. That's about it. So our job is to find the best possible deal for that risk characteristic and then invite investors into it. So to distill that into answering your question, there's only so much time in a day, and you want to work with investors that are smart enough to understand the risk-reward scenario, because when things go well, I'm a hero, but when things go badly, either you're the bad guy or the deal was bad, and you kind of need to find investors who can differentiate between the two. And the deal could be bad because of the environment or the deal itself or the sector, and we spend an extraordinary amount of time explaining that to investors. So once you start finessing that, the sophistication of the investor grows. With it comes a larger, let's say, larger tickets and more ambition on the real estate side. You could evaluate different risks and returns, and would have enabled us to go into more value add space, if you will.
Yeah, and I guess as your schooling, your learning, the feedback, what works, what doesn't work, as your reputation and brand get bigger, and you're seen as a trusted partner in the market, people start bringing you bigger deals, and your own personal wealth accumulates, and you want to allocate that further. Talk to me about your recollections of the 2007-2008 GFC, because you touched on a golden period between 96 and that period.
Yeah.
I don't think I've spoken to anyone who hasn't had their fair number of challenges during that period. Was that the first real kind of setback? And
so I would say, actually the term I was looking for was the baptism of fire, right? When I joined and you buy an asset with 14 tenants in it, that's a baptism of fire in terms of acquisition, management, and so forth. And then come 96 to 2006, almost anything we bought went up in value. And, I would say my ego made the mistake of thinking it was my doing. And thank God for the 2007, 2009 crash, which taught me very, very quickly that the market can take you up and bring you down very, very quickly, and there's very little that's really in your control. The things that you can control are just the way that you deal with problems, and pretty much nothing else. So we already felt that the market was extremely tight approaching 2007. So I remember a deal that we offered on, and I think it was early 2006. It was already quite a warm market, so you'd be evaluating lots and lots of deals and not succeeding in being able to buy anything. On the flip side, everything you owned, you could ask for whatever you wanted, and chances are you would get it. Also, everything you owned, you could probably borrow 80, 90% against it. So on where we were owners, we had a quandary, do we refinance, take all the equity out, sell it for a little bit more equity? And so more often than not, the investors said, why don't you just refinance and hold and recycle the capital into new deals? But trying to recycle capital into new deals was very, very difficult. You stretch all the assumptions and still nothing really made sense. So I remember bidding on an asset early 2006, and we came 19 out of 20 on that particular asset. And I looked at my dad, and we just felt that we didn't understand the market. There was something substantially wrong with us and maybe how we evaluate deals. But we couldn't figure out what. So what do? You just carry on keeping yourself busy, or trying to keep busy. So we did refinance quite a bit and return money to investors and try to do deals. And we did a mixture of refinances and sales of assets, and then watched people who'd bought those assets off us, flip them for another 10 or 15% thereafter, feeling a little bit sick. But that is the market. And then I first heard the term credit crunch. It was summer 2007, and somebody mentioned that term, and I didn't quite know what it was. And then obviously 6 months, 9 months later, we all understood what that term was. And the financial crisis, I think the MSCI index fell 44% summer of 2007 to summer of 2008. So that's probably the biggest crash that in modern real estate history, I think, in terms of values. So we ended up with lots of assets underwater. with our banking partners no longer partners, if you will, and investors all kind of in shock because book values had been decimated, albeit they were still sat on decent amounts of cash. And so, my father and I began firefighting, and with the small team that we had at that point, firefighting tenants who couldn't pay. Maybe you take back properties that you didn't really want. Managing banking relationships, managing investor relationships, and I'd say we spent there wasn't any deals to acquire that between the summer of 2007 to December 2008. So we spent 18 months with a fire hose pretty much everywhere. We had to get on the plane much more often to see the investors because everybody wanted to know what was going on. They themselves were quite confused because the whole financial world was upside down. And then come early 2009, and you could feel that the financial world is going to survive, and investors had cash, and there were many more sellers than buyers of real estate. So that's when we started getting busy buying things again, things that we would have looked at in the 2-3 years prior, that we did the due diligence on, really liked, couldn't get anywhere near the price, and you could buy that at 40% cheaper than you tried to buy it 2-3 years prior, where interest rates were 0 as opposed to 4 or 5%. So it was a much easier underwrite. All you needed was the conviction and the money. And so we worked quite hard with the investors and managed to do a few deals that time.
And I guess, some people got blown out of the water because they were just far too over-levered at that stage. And actually, by the time they got through the kind of the firefighting process, they had to fire sell everything, or it was taken off them. And actually, they didn't have a portfolio or a business left.
Yeah.
Just how painful was it for you and the business at that time? Because you talk about, being able to then identify the buying window and kind of get your house in order to kind of go again.
Yeah.
I personally have never been in that position, but I can imagine, or I can only imagine, that it must be a very, very hard thing going through a period of, elation through to, wow, the market has really fallen away, to, the kind of the stages of grief, the pain and the challenge and the challenges that you have to kind of come through, to then managing that with investors, to mopping up and clearing the slate and your ego being battered, through to, oh, actually now's a really good window to go and buy again, and having the conviction to take that bet at that particular stage.
So, when you're in the trenches, there is not much to do but keep plowing on. In retrospect, I often wonder why we do business the way we do business. It's extremely difficult to dealing with a whole bunch of investors, doing deals in a live environment, juggling so many balls, and still managing to close transactions, managing asset investment, managing them, and then selling them at the end. And quite often, I often think, why do we do it this way? Why don't we do it a different way? But it's periods like those that sort of bring the resilience of our business model into its own. So each deal is ring-fenced. Each deal has its own club of investors. We work quite hard at making sure that the investors are not overexposed to any one particular deal or any one particular vintage or sector or geography. And what that enabled us to do is, again, I'm using the term differently in this case, sort of ring-fence the old assets and still have the mindset, the wherewithal to be able to look at new assets. So our job was twofold, right? One, manage the problems and at the same time take advantage of the opportunities. If you're, not all eggs are in one basket, and with a diverse bunch of investors, you are able to call upon them to start looking at the opportunities. Or to put it another way, each and every one of our investors is a businessman. And he understands when the market goes down, it's both a threat and an opportunity. And half of our investors would have called us up and said, I totally get what's happened to our existing portfolio. What that, of course, means, Mansukh, Manish, is that there must be some extraordinary deals out there. Keep us in mind when those come about. And so our investors really gave us, in the depths of difficult times, when every phone call is a tenant or a bank who's going to cause you a sleepless night, somebody calling you up and saying, don't forget there's opportunity out there. And sort of those rays of light, sunshine, whatever you want to call it, investor calls that came through, gave us the strength to be able to be front foot as well.
Yeah, and I guess, as you touched on, you and your father probably led the transactions in terms of your own risk appetite, and then went to investors to say, we're bullish on this, we're in on this, and we're putting our money where our mouth is. Do you want in? Rather than the other way around.
Yes.
It's not like you're trying to force investors to take deals and for you to be a very, very small minority co-invest, to justify the fee revenue stream to keep the other business going while you deal with the assets underwater. Yeah. It's the kind of the courage and the conviction to say, actually, we've been burnt as well, but actually we're going again, and do you want to come alongside us?
Yeah.
Property is a people business, hence the name People Property Place. Business has been tough the last couple of years. Get the people aspect wrong, business becomes impossible. Get the people aspect right, it's still hard, but it's manageable, much more enjoyable, and you're much more likely to hit your goals. So if you're looking to add top talent to your team in 2025 and you're open-minded to an alternative approach and you're keen to make business a little less hard, drop me a DM. I'd love to have a conversation with you to see how Rockborn could potentially help you with your human capital requirements. Right, let's get back to the podcast. Talk to me about that kind of, that post GFC 2009, because, again, good buying window, re-establish confidence, re-establish track record, grow, build and scale the business and the team, and further professionalize and institutionalize the platform further.
Yeah, so the truth is that we started buying assets that we could never dream of owning in 2009. I think a lot of investors were ready to sell everything that they could sell. In that sort of a market, what you could sell is likely to be the best quality, or as a buyer, you want the best quality for the lowest price possible. And that opportunity I haven't seen. Obviously, in retrospect, it existed in 2009. It didn't feel like it at that point in time. So we started buying larger assets. I remember it was April 2009. We were probably one of the first people out the blocks post-GFC. And we bought the headquarters of the Welsh National Assembly for one of our investors in Cardiff. And, that's a 23-year income stream to the government at quite an interesting yield. And various other things that we would have looked at in 2006 and 2007 that we liked, but we couldn't buy. We went ahead and bought them at, say, a 40% discount to what we'd previously offered. The market stabilized very quickly after that, actually. So come 2010, 2011, we had the opportunity to start selling the assets at probably 20-25% above what we'd paid for them. And what that did is it built investor confidence very rapidly. Obviously, you're making profits, you want to recycle the capital, but also that the market that nearly died now is actually quite vibrant. Existing large owners of real estate still had quite a bit of holding assets that they weren't comfortable with. So there was lots of buying opportunity still there, but our investors had a lot of conviction. Then there was the European crisis that was going on at that time. If you remember what was called the pigs, and people concerned about the euro surviving and so forth. So generally, conviction was still lacking in the market. And so we pursued two strategies. Obviously, one was opportunistic, as to buy assets that you liked and were at the right sort of price. And the other one was, buy new assets. Nobody knew where rents sat in 2009, 10, 11, 12, right? An office building could be over rented by 2 or 3 times. So could retail. So, it was very difficult to evaluate where real rents lay, where yields could be, how was the tenant trading from that property? It's difficult to evaluate. So we started buying new assets that were land that was purchased post-financial crisis, construction costs post-financial crisis, and rents set post-financial crisis. And roughly translated, that meant budget hotels, because they were in ascendancy. So Travelodges and Premier Inn really started growing their portfolio at that point in time, because they were strong tenants and managed to get city center sites as opposed to being roadside. So we found that quite interesting. We did some student accommodation. We did a couple of logistics assets. They used to be called industrial at that time. I remember, we did in 2011. We Ford committed to purchase the Marks and Spencer's distribution warehouse at Castle Donington. So that was 1 million square foot. And I remember we paid 5.8% yield for that. And I got a couple of calls saying, "What are you doing?" I think that was probably the record tightest yield paid for an industrial asset. But of course, it was their primary logistics hub. And so it's things like that we were doing. So if you're calling a theme, let's call it phoenixed out of the financial crisis theme, and that will remain resilient going forward for the foreseeable future. In the event interest rates continue to stay lower for longer, I'd like to think we had something to do with asset choice. So I think we chose good assets, and interest rates stayed lower for longer. For all the core assets that we acquired, it looked like an extraordinary time, because you're buying at high yields, selling into a more institutionalizing market at tighter and tighter yields, and recycling the capital quicker and quicker.
So that Phoenix, you really kind of snapped back out and re-established yourself.
Yes.
And shored up the capital flows and structure of the business.
Yeah.
One of the things you touched on a few minutes ago in our conversation that I don't want to gloss over is you touched on the challenge and the difficulty. And I'm assuming you mean finding the deal, finding the equity, finding the debt all at the same time on a deal-by-deal basis.
Yeah.
Why do you still do that rather than go down raising discretionary funds, given the kind of the track record that you have had?
Wow. Okay, that's a really, really big question. If you think about an individual property, it has its own life cycle, and it needs its own strategy. It needs to be ideally bought at the right time, the right things done to it, and positioned in the right way, and make sure it's fit for purpose. That is quite a complicated thing to do on any asset, and we do it asset by asset. We take debt. That's a complication. That isn't property related. It's an arbitrary, artificial thing that you apply to the bricks and mortar. That's dangerous as well as accretive, depending on where you sit. And then you overlay that with fixed time frames of entry and exit, I think you start complicating your life one step too far. So if you have a fixed life fund, and, again, I don't mean to be speaking out of turn, but, there's an 18-month window to raise money, then another 18 months to 2 years to deploy, hold for 5 years, 7 years, whatever it may be, and then exit. If you time that wrong, you've pretty much done your coconuts. I don't know if I'm allowed to say that, but, that's, and it could be wildly successful, but you could be wildly unsuccessful that way. So bringing that conservative Gujarati mindset again, you do asset by asset, ring-fenced over a period of time, over sectors, over geographies, different, whether it's core plus value add, again, horses for courses in terms of what you pay for it, what you do to it, and you follow its own trajectory. It kind of keeps you resilient. It kind of keeps you fresh. And, we had very little retail going into the financial crisis, for example. And the reason is that retailers' profits were going down, rents continued to go up, and again, it didn't stack up. And the prices that people were paying us for our retail assets just didn't make sense. So we sold most of the retail at that point in time. Not because we're geniuses, it's just something didn't stack up. And if you're dynamic about your asset choice and you're buying and selling all the time, you kind of able to ride the cycles a little bit better. And that's a long-winded way of saying, it's very difficult what we do, but I think it keeps us fresh and resilient.
Yeah, which makes a lot of sense. The question that might come up is, when you're looking to buy an asset, a vendor might say, well, show us your bank statement. Have you got the 50 million, 20 million, 5 million, 10 million, 100 million, whatever it is, to be a credible counterparty here? You're telling me, yes, you're there for it, but you're only as good as the last deal. You've got to go and raise the money.
Yeah.
How do you overcome that?
I mean, if there's a problem with our business model, that's it. All right, Matt, you hit the nail on the head there. I guess you've got to rely on your network. One of the reasons I like this business so much is that your relationships take a long time to build. You rely on your relationships a lot, and I enjoy the relationships a lot, and they drive real value. So I'd say the market knows how we operate. Being conservative, we tend to go for things that we know we can close. I would have known my investor on average 15 years, on average across 15 deals. I might have attended their kids' or grandkids' weddings, for example. So I kind of know I'll be able to do the deal before I go for it. And it's very difficult to convince a new seller that this is the way it works. Luckily, the relationships, the market knows us, and our sort of 37-year history does pay off. Then I often get, I don't know how it works, Manish. You deliver every time, so therefore I'm going to recommend you make sure you don't fail me, or whatever, that type of a conversation. And that's kind of how we do business. It does mean that there will be certain deals we won't be able to do. Blackstone was selling something in 2009. The only people that were invited were discretionary capital money in the bank and would be excluded from a process like that, for example. But remember, at any point in time, I mean, over the last sort of 7 years, we've had $1 billion to $1.7 billion under management as well, right? So we're constantly transacting on both sides, selling and buying. And so, you can't amalgamate or assemble a portfolio of that size without having the ability to do so. So I guess that keeps us in good stead.
Can you give me a bit of an overview, a snapshot of the business as we sit here in the early part of September 2025, just from a people and kind of an asset and maybe AUM kind of perspective?
Yeah. So I guess our AUM sort of peaked at 1.7 billion in 2017. And 2017, 2018, 2019, we did exit quite a few core assets and moved into quite a bit of operational real estate, hotels and pubs notably. And the pandemic wasn't kind to us throughout that period. So, we were, let's say, 11 strong going into 2015, and then we started scaling up quite a bit. We were probably about 40 strong going into the pandemic. We're around 17 today, reflecting kind of how the business, the sort of things that we get involved in. So operations are very heavy lifting, and so we bulked up to be able to do that. We're less and less operationally orientated, back to probably more what's core plus, if you will, and the team sort of flexes accordingly. I'd say gross assets under management are around 1 billion at this moment in time. Leverage is probably 55%, and so that sort of gives you an idea of the amount of cash that's under management. A lot of it has existed for quite a number of years and is the similar money that's recycled. And there's always some investors sort of switching off, and thankfully more investors switching on at any point in time. Again, talking about how we operate, we're not a fund. We don't have to deploy. It's not like we already have capital that needs to be deployed. It's very opportunity orientated. If we like something, that's when we go and raise money for it. So, September 2025, you've got to be a little bit careful about what you buy. Not that we're not always, but, I think the macro challenges are enormous. You've got all kinds of political things going on all over the world. You've got some pretty strong economic headwinds in the UK as it stands. We're coming through quite a difficult time on the interest rate side, post-pandemic, government borrowing, availability of debt, the cost of debt, the cost of capital, investor conviction, you name it. The challenges are bigger than I've ever seen before. But again, as I was saying, there's always opportunity in that as well. So we remain careful, open, and still energized by the environment we're in.
What are you most excited about when you kind of look out across the market, and where do you sense that there's a big opportunity?
So this time reminds me not of the financial crisis. Actually, in the financial crisis, remember we entered 2007 with interest rates at 5%, and we left 2009 with interest rates at pretty much zero. But what my father reminds me is that in 1989, we entered interest rates at 4, 5, 6%, I can't quite remember, and ended up at 14%. It's the sort of scale of interest rate rises that we have seen recently. So if you ask my father, this time is much more reminiscent of 89, 92 than 2007, 2009. And I'd say that the 92 onwards vintage was equally as good, if not slightly better than the 2009 vintage onwards. And, I think the word is sort of dislocation. There is significant dislocation in the market. A lot of it's still to come through. It'll come through in the way humans use assets. How is the office going to be used? What are retailers going to do to to attract the different kind of retail environment. You know, we all know what logistics or sheds and so forth are doing. There are new sectors like data centers. Living itself is changing quite a bit, right? You know, you've got build to rent, and you know, you've got student accommodation that's now a very established asset class. In fact, I think you start seeing a bit of oversupply in certain sectors, but still undersupply in certain in certain geographies. So, I mean, it's still a very rich market from an opportunity perspective, and so, you know, obviously living is very resilient. It's not easy to deploy and manage, but it is something that we are already invested in and like. And some of the new sectors we would like to deploy in. Obviously, hospitality is something that we know very well. We'll continue to deploy in that. But having invested in every asset class over 30 years, you know, we remain open to see where the opportunities come from.
And I know you've just bought the St John's Wood portfolio as well.
Yes, absolutely. So that's going back to retail, back to high street shops and uppers, kind of where my father started in the mid to late 80s. So it's funny that obviously what attracted us to St John's Wood High Street is that it's a fantastic high street, and you could buy a decent enough scale on it to have a little bit of impact as to what it's going to look like going forward. And it was an interesting risk versus return calculation that we did on it.
How do you, as kind of a family-run, family value-orientated business, and that kind of really comes across just in terms of the relationships with capital, the relationships with your father, the emphasis you put on kind of deal selection, management, transparency, and openness through the good times and the bad times with various different stakeholders.
Yeah.
How do you go about building a high-performing team? And what do you look for from a technical and behavioral perspective for, you know, team members that you bring into the business?
Oof. I think it's always going to be a work in progress. I would say culture trumps ability. Obviously, you want the best culture and the best ability in one person. But if you were evaluating people, you know, integrity, transparency, and the idea of service is something that has to be ingrained in you. And with that, you know, we bring in, we have lots of experience of capital markets, assets, geographies, you know, banking, and so on and so forth. But, you know, if the culture is not quite right, you can't supplement that. You could supplement any other skill or knowledge, but the culture has to be right. So I'd say that has to be top of the list of the values characteristics that you're looking at within your team. And of course, you know, they've got to be able to do the job probably better than you could do that job, right? And so that's the other sort of thing that we're looking at. How you keep people motivated and energized. You know, again, I think everybody who works with us will say we really like, enjoy, and value the family type environment. You get what you see, and I think people enjoy that. So, and that's what we kind of look for in the people that we work with.
What's it like working with your old man?
Woo.
Who, by the way, is still very active in the business.
Well, very much so.
I mean, I have had the fortunate pleasure of meeting him.
So he's 84 years old. He still takes the tube to come into the office. It's the most efficient way, 35 minutes door to door. What's it like to work with him, for him? You know, it's a real privilege. Looking back, it's a phenomenal opportunity. I would never change it for anything. We've had our difficult times, as you can imagine. I'm a young whippersnapper who wants to prove himself and accelerate the business, and I can always do it better than you can, Dad. And so we had quite a few strong words. Again, in retrospect, I look back and I think, do you know what? There are very few people who will be brutally honest with you. And my father did the privilege of being brutally honest with me. And I think you learn lessons in a very accelerated way and in a way that you don't forget. And I think that sort of shortens the time frame of you coming up to speed. And he's still very active, a phenomenal sounding board. He'll have, obviously he's been in the business 37 years. I've been there 30 years. I'd say you total the two, it should be about 150 years because you compound the two. And I think, it's an incredible opportunity that I've been so lucky to have.
There's one thing working with your father. There's another thing working with your wife.
Yes, absolutely.
And Meenal Devani is your wife.
Yeah.
And she is an absolute powerhouse.
Yeah.
She's incredible.
Yeah. So I should, in that case, it's definitely I work for Meenal Devani as opposed to work with Meenal Devani. Look, it's very, very challenging, as you can imagine. When being of the culture and origin that we are, there is very little boundary between work and life, right? It sort of commingles. As you can imagine, a lot of our investors are very close friends. It has its pluses, it has its minuses as well, particularly in difficult times. It's difficult conversation to have with people that you're very close with. And the same applies when working with your spouse, right? The office comes home with you. We're both very passionate about what we do. And that comes through in some of the discussions that we'll be having, and I think it's healthy to have certain disagreements, but fundamentally, we know we have each other's backs, right? And just like working with my father, it's irreplaceable. And so, yeah, I think it's enjoyable, and I think more than anything else, it is extremely valuable. We're all pushing in the same direction. We're all going for the same goal. We all have the same values. And I think the investors can see that and gain a lot of faith out of that. And hopefully that translates into an ever successful business.
As we draw to a close, the question I ask everyone on the podcast is, if I was to give you £500 million worth of capital, who are the people, what property, in which place would you look to allocate it?
We talked about the market, the macro being in a very precarious place. And maybe I could tell you what I wouldn't invest in, and then maybe I can narrow down to what we could invest in. And I would say, building anything new is going to be difficult, right? The cost of capital is high, the risks are multiple, and time means that. So the passage of time means that you'll be delivering something new into an environment. Whether the letting or the capital markets are going to be able to absorb and sustain it is difficult. Those sort of things we find difficult to understand and to underwrite with confidence. And again, going back to our roots, it's income orientated. So, you can't go too far wrong with income. You have to evaluate the resilience of that income, and that's where we specialize. So we look at those income streams, evaluate its resilience and its relative value today. What our investors help us do is look at fundamental value, right? Is this investment as good as, I don't know, Mexican telecom investments and so forth. And so you take all of that mixed up and all those eyes, those brains, and you distill it into what it is that we are capable of doing today. It would be existing assets in sectors that have longevity, and at the right sort of capital values. And so if you look at what we deploy into, it would be very long leases with very understandable income streams underlying the asset. So that would be ground rents on operational hotels or pubs or nursing homes or, operational assets, student accommodation. Living is also quite interesting. Everybody needs a roof over their heads or, beds, if you will. But again, it's very, very competitive out there. There's a lot of capital chasing that type of stuff. So we find our opportunity, whether it's by taking a slightly contrarian view or moving quickly, which we're able to do with our the way we do business. We've done a bit of logistics. Obviously 2009, 10, 11, 12, we did quite a bit. The environment is still quite aggressive for it, but we will find our the deals that work for us within that space. So I know it's a bit of a cliche. Those are all asset classes that a lot of people already deploy into. There's a reason why, and so in a nutshell, it's resilient income. That's what we're looking for.
Manish, phenomenal career. Some high highs, some low lows, but get the honest, straightforward answer. So I really appreciate the transparency, the openness, and walk down memory lane. And I'm really excited to see what you and the team go on to do as you kind of capitalize on the opportunities moving forward. And as I said at the start of this podcast, it's a real privilege and a genuine honor that you've joined me today to share a little bit about your background and story. So thank you.
That's very kind of you to say, Matt, and thank you for the opportunity.
Hey, quick one from me. If you enjoyed this conversation, do me a favor and share it with a friend or colleague that you think would get value from this conversation. It would mean the world and help grow the People Property Place podcast. Thank you so much.